Hello and welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 161 review. This was a regular 2-week sprint. Okay. I'll provide the overview. Kavya will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Jason on a number of things. So this sprint, we trended down in terms of the number of pull requests opened and merged. I think some of that is attributable to the fact that IBM, many of us at IBM had a long weekend. So there were 2 fewer working days in the sprint. We'll see if we can recover to previous levels next sprint. In terms of the number of the PR spread, 17 were bugs, 24 enhancements. You'll recall that in last sprint, we announced Losker beta release. And so as that's getting stabilized, we're focusing more on the next set of features, which is why you see a lot more enhancements than bugs this go around. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kavya.
Hey, thanks, Oleg. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This sprint here, we have total 10 PRs that got merged across UI repos. Out of 10, 4 bugs, 3 enhancements, and so on. These are some of the important PRs that got merged. Next slide, please. This fix is contributed by a community user. All alerts page is broken completely. Fixed that in this PR. This PR is backported to Jansa as well. Next slide, please. Here for non-admin users, chargeback actions are giving an error. Joe fixed that issue in this PR. This is backported to Jansa, Kasparov, and Lasker builds as well. Next slide, please. Here, this is just a minor CSS issue, but an important one. In left nav on submenu headings, hover and click background colors are almost the same, which looks very bad in the UI. Fix that in this PR. Next slide, please. This is an enhancement which we worked on in the sprint. Here we are just adding last refreshed status in the notification in provider dashboard. Notification only displays when last refreshed status is either error or last refreshed date is more than 2 days old. Same information is present in summary page too, but it is kind of hidden in bottom of summary page. So hopefully this will help in debugging provider issues. Next slide, please. This change is part of technical dev done by Nick. Here removed authentication from Jones form in the UI. Right now it is still allowed from Rails console, but just removed from UI. You can see more details in the PR. I think that's all from the UI. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Kavya. So this sprint, as part of some other provider work, we fixed the subclassing of resource groups. These were, rather than being subclassed and namespaced under a particular manager type, they're actually at the same level as the vendor, which was originally done with the intention of it being cross manager, but it turns out they're all just owned by the cloud manager. And so we moved these into the cloud manager. So now it's consistent with the rest of the inventory groups. And that allowed us to reduce some code that we were going to have to do in order to inventory these. So we actually got this more in line with the rest of the collections and also deleted a bunch of duplicate code. We refactored the acts as leaf class to not infect the parent class. So this is basically what a provider would do to subclass another provider. Previously, this was included in the base class, which isn't necessarily obvious when you're looking at it why it's doing that. Whereas when you look at it in the child class, it's more obvious because you're also subclassing from that there. So that just cleans up the base class a little bit more, moves the logic into the location that's closer to where it's being used, and it's more obvious when you're looking at it. We got a couple more pluggable secrets in the providers. So OpenShift and OpenStack landed this sprint. Overt actually landed one day after the sprint, so we'll cover that next week, but that's almost done. For IBM Cloud VPC, Jared added an enhancement to link floating IPs to instances. These were already being collected, but we weren't doing the reference between the IP and the instance, so they weren't being shown on the UI. So now you can actually see the floating IP address on the instance list on the UI. He also added an enhancement to collect resource groups, which is why we started out with the refactoring that we talked about before. These are required for the provisioning work that also landed in the next sprint, and we'll cover that next sprint review. Next slide. For Kubernetes, we noticed a bug when OpenShift is deployed on a Power architecture. There was a null byte in the node system UUID, and so when we were trying to do a query to look up the VM UID, Postgres was blowing up saying that it didn't understand what the string was. So we're now stripping those out to allow that to go through. For Nuage, David fixed an issue with the cloud subnet DDF form. It was actually using the wrong association. It was using networks instead of cloud networks. So it wasn't finding anything, as networks are more of a VM IP address thing, not the cloud network. For OpenStack, we allowed for network manager subclassing. We did this for the cloud manager previously, but now we're also doing this for the network manager since that was added to a provider, which is subclassing it. I want to give it away, but next slide. So this is why we're doing that. So IBM Powervc is a new provider which landed this sprint. It is a distribution of the OpenStack provider that runs on the Power architecture. And it's including a cloud manager, a network manager, and a Cinder manager. So you can go to that IBM products page to get a detailed view of what the product is. And the repository is here if anyone wants to check the code out or contribute. And if we go to the next slide, we should have a short demo from Ms. Gundar. This is up on the ManageIQ YouTube channel, so you can go and check this out. So it is right here. If we go and add a new cloud provider, you can see the Powervc right there. So right now, all the same options as OpenStack. They're actually going to trim this down since it's a little bit, there are fewer options from a full OpenStack distribution. So we're going to try to make it a little bit simpler for the user rather than try to guess. They're going to trim down some of these options. So if we give the IP address of this guy, this is also the kind of the foundation for this work is importing images from on-premise Powervc into the PowerVS cloud. So you'll see at the bottom, there's a node location, node username, etc. That's actually in support of this feature. So if you give credentials to the Powervc node, it's going to be used in the future to allow import and export of images. So we did the added the credentials there, validated, and was saved. It's going to kick off a refresh shortly. And I think through the magic of editing, it's already done. Once he refreshes, there it is. So you can see we're collecting instances, flavors, images, everything that you'd expect from a full OpenStack distribution. There's no Swift provider, but there's a Cinder provider. And so all of that, compute, network, and storage are all being collected already. And that's it for providers. Over to Jason.
Thanks, Adam. That was really cool. On the platform side, Brandon worked on added to the container HTTP init container, logging the standard out and standard error. This puts it in line with the regular container HTTPD container and helps with us debugging and using a EFK stack on Kubernetes. Brandon also added listing all the known server GUIDs if the deployment status is new replica. This is more of a diagnostic feature on Kubernetes. If you redeploy and it gets a new GUID, the operator doesn't let you continue, or the orchestrator doesn't let you continue, but then you don't know what the value should be. So this helps you figure that out. Joe R added an enhancement to add validation of worker memory, CPU request and limit. If you change the settings and do things like put the threshold lower than the request, that's not a valid value for Kubernetes. And we wanted to make sure we validated that up front so that the user doesn't actually shoot themselves in the foot. Keenan added a change to the appliance as well as the containers to remove unnecessary HTTP headers. In particular, the Apache server information was coming through, which can kind of be a security issue. If an attacker knows what kind of Apache server version you're running, they can potentially do, see that you have an old version and attack you. So since we don't need the headers, we remove them. Keenan also added, changed to use properties files for environment variables. This is a feature of systemd that allows you to use a properties file which lists out the environment variables. And since most of our environment variables are static, this should make launching systemd-based workers a lot simpler. It also allows us to do the same thing or a similar thing on the podified side when you load up a pod. And finally, I added a feature to the ManageIQ loggers to honor the container log level. This is a long debated feature, but out in the field, we've noticed that we've wanted to change the container log level from debug because debug output is just so voluminous. So now we're going to honor it. I have got the change into ManageIQ loggers, but we still have to get it into the actual application. So that'll be coming in probably a future sprint. On the bug side, Joe fixed the broken non-admin login. Kavya showed that a little bit in a screenshot earlier. And this is Joe fixed the actual feature itself. Support services without a user being set. Keenan got a change in for that, going toward his work toward getting rid of root. Bundler inject was requiring root, and this allows it to work without a user. And finally, Brandon fixed an issue where backup labels to the PVCs in the operator were not being set. So that was added in now. And so backup and restore should include those PVCs. Next slide, please. On the API side, the only change we had was a bug fix from Adam to allow the creation of automation managers via API. It was excluded for some reason, and he added that back in. Next slide, please. And finally, on the developer side, I added initial docs for running Keycloak and container HTTPD locally with your local dev setup. So if you need to test OIDC, you can spin up a Keycloak and a container HTTPD and run it all locally. Right now, it only works on Mac. Hopefully in future, I can get some Linux users to help me out getting it work on Linux and also with Podman. But for now, it helped us solve some issues where users with special characters in particular, a bug that was fixed last sprint. This was how I went about fixing it. The bundler inject gem, we upgraded to 2.0. We eliminated some old Ruby versions, old bundler versions, and also it included Keenan's fix that I just mentioned a moment ago with the missing user support. And finally, we bumped Rubocop to 113, and this should affect all of the repos. 113 is, last I checked, the latest version of Rubocop, so we're finally on the latest. And now that we have ManageIQ style, it's a lot simpler to get to latest versions. So if you see us not on a latest version, let us know. We'll try to get that updated as soon as possible. One other thing, upgrading versions usually leads to more cops. And so if there's a cop you don't agree with, we can open up an issue in ManageIQ style, and we can vote on whether or not we want to keep the defaults or change them. And that's it on the developer side.
All right. So we'll be back in 2 weeks on May 26th for Sprint 162 review. Note the new time, it's 1:30 in the afternoon Eastern. It used to be at 10:30. This will be the new standard time for ManageIQ Sprint reviews. And the Zoom link is below. And with that, I want to thank all the presenters, all the contributors, and the whole ManageIQ community. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.